This video was made possible by Skillshare. Get access to over 20,000 premium courses for free for 2 months using the link down below.
I am so excited, I wonder when my new hardware's gonna get here.
What is this garbage? It has been a weird couple of months for someone more interested in how technology changes the affordable side of things, with Nvidia's new generation almost monopolizing the conversation, with some gadgets that, while do introduce some pretty amazing technology, follow an absolutely worrying trend of mainstream consumer technology dramatically increasing in costs. I felt a glimmer of hope when AMD silently announced a new APU on the Athlon brand. For years now, the Athlon name has been associated with affordable CPUs for office or casual applications, kinda like Intel's Pentium, but it has been surprisingly absent during the current generation until now. But this time, there's a little something that makes this APU special. In what feels like an eternity ago, but was actually just March, me and the rest of the PC gaming internet was fascinated with the newest low-end member of the Ryzen family, the 2200G. This fascination stemmed from the fact that it was the first APU that uses their modern Vega architecture on an integrated GPU, giving it performance way over any Intel HD that I have seen and closer to a dedicated GPU. It was not bad for a $100 chip. You can even overclock it and do some VR on it. AMD do know how to make their APUs after all. Now, they seem to have noted those lessons that they have learned and taken the concept further to release the Athlon 200GE, which costs a little over half of that cheap Ryzen APU. For that price, we get a 2-core 4-thread CPU with an integrated GPU using the same Vega architecture that gave the 2200G its magic. Weaker, but still pretty good. On the other side, the cost reduction means that it does not support overclocking, and the fastest RAM it supports is 266 MHz. The marketing material seems to place it closer to general use and light productivity, and hey, it can run light video or picture editing, so if you want to spend as little as possible to start your creative career, that is not a bad option, as is getting those creative skills from Skillshare with over 20,000 classes on video game creation, design, editing. No, stop, we're barely 3 minutes into the video, save it for later. And if you try to look into gaming on this APU, you will notice that the same marketing material mentions it as viable for esports games, a growing marketing term for things like League of Legends or Csgo. Here's it playing Doom at 720p, 80% internal resolution scaler, and shadows removed with the console commands from my video on the topic. This is not a huge surprise given that Vega supports Vulkan and the intense level of optimization of this game that allows it to run in some really absurd scenarios, but it is still pretty amazing. Not a bad start for this little guy. Perhaps more interesting is Wolfenstein-the New Colossus. This is another important case study since it has given trouble to many of my best dedicated GPUs, but it has proven effective on Ryzen APUs, and our little Athlon was definitely not excluded. In order to push the integrated GPU to the maximum, unlike Doom, I decided to push for 720p with no internal resolution scaler, but I used my trick from the video to disable shadows, and just to make things a bit harder, I threw it right in the middle of a pretty intense combat scene. The result was almost stable 30 FPS, with the game only dropping to around 25 on the crazier moments. This is crazy good performance for this game on a device on this price range with an integrated GPU. Then is Nier Automata, running on 960 by 540. This game does not get any level of acceptable performance on its usual low settings, but if you throw in the FAR mode that I talked about in my video on this game and disable global illumination, it can at least keep close to 30, and just enough to actually get by with the game. Honestly, I did not expect this game to work. Let's keep climbing this hill to try Far Cry 5 on the lowest settings and a resolution of 720p and the internal resolution scaler to 50%. If you watch my video on this topic, you likely know that there's a fair amount of graphical reduction that you can do on this game on the configuration file, and I have added most of them, except the changes to the draw distance, since I wanted to simulate a state in which you can actually play this game. And to my surprise, the Athlon averages 53 FPS, holy cow! I reckon you could play without all the tweaks at 30 FPS if needed. How does the performance disaster that is PUBG on PC work? Amazingly, that is how. Here I am playing at 720p and an internal resolution of 50% via the configuration file, and being indoors or outdoors it can do something like 45 FPS. This is another success that I did not expect. I played a full match on this game without any issues. A new addition to my test suite is the newly released Shadow of the Tomb Raider. While I'm yet to find any way to boost this game, I'm working on a video regarding its DX12 implementation, which dramatically reduces CPU usage, and sure enough, running this benchmark on lowest settings, 720p, 50% internal resolution and DirectX 12 easily lands it on an average of over 30 FPS, most of the time limited by the integrated GPU. Considering that this is a game that released not that long ago, this might be as bad as it gets for GPU performance. Lighter titles, which are closer to whatever the heck esport games meant, obviously do superbly. Fortnite and its crazy optimization at 1080 but internal resolution set at 50% and lowest settings provides almost a smooth 60 FPS with drops close to 55 when there's a lot to render, but overall solid performance even in moments of great necessity. Free-to-play Quake Champions on minimum settings, 720p and a 50% internal resolution scaler easily breaks 60 FPS, only dropping under that when things get a bit too close and personal. And older but popular games like Rocket League on 1080 and the lowest presets provides an expected but solid over 60 FPS performance, which borders closer to 80. And since I know you're going to ask, the Csgo benchmark did spectacularly in 1080, with over 60 FPS in average performance, and as usual, keep in mind that the benchmark average is likely lower than what you actually will see in the game. Now, something that you might have caught on here is that for all of these titles, the main bottleneck or limiter of the performance is the integrated GPU. Given that part of the appeal of building a setup with this little guy is its easy upgradability, I was wondering how much of a problem its dual-core nature can be on CPU-heavy titles. Which finally takes me to the only esports title that I'm actually competent at, Overwatch. Overwatch is notorious among the games I like to test for being exceptionally light on GPU, but a tad higher on its CPU usage than most games out there when aiming for 60 FPS. And that got initially reflected on my test. I started playing on the lowest settings, 720p and 50% resolution scaler, and look at those 4 threads suffering. The integrated GPU is more than able to aim for 60 FPS initially, but the dual-core CPU can struggle a fair bit when trying to reach 60 FPS. Thankfully, this is easily solvable with a 45 FPS cap, or more realistically using the trick I mentioned on one of my Overwatch videos to auto-close battle.net and also remove everything from the startup that could be using the CPU. The effect is very noticeable. I was able to play a full match comfortably on a 75% resolution scale. No issues, it just works. Since I wanted to explore the limits of the CPU, I tried Battlefront 2. Well, I know what some of the comments will say. From a technical perspective, the Frostbite engine this runs on is probably the heaviest CPU user of all the engines I have ever tried, while being very considerate in GPU usage, and Battlefront 2 is the heaviest game with that engine, at least until Battlefield 5 releases. My testing went as I expected. On the lowest settings, 720p, 50% resolution scale and some adjustments from my video using the terminal, the integrated GPU had plenty of space to try and reach 60 FPS, but those 2 cores and 4 threads are struggling quite a bit. Here it does kinda turn into an issue as Frostbite does tend to micro stutter when CPU bound, but it is very close to getting there. Limiting it to something like 45 FPS gets rid of that problem entirely and provides a pretty good gaming experience. This is the one time that I'm frustrated that the CPU is not unlocked and therefore not overclockable. I get so close to being able to pull 60 FPS on a Frostbite game that I have a suspicion that all it will have required is just a tiny overclock. Silver lining is that if you're building a PC from scratch, you can cheap out on the motherboard and get an A320 chipset. which is a great transition into the next section. How budget-oriented is it? For the purposes of this video, I decided to act like I was building a PC in 3 different locations: United States, Spain, and India. I picked this APU as the CPU and GPU, a cheap motherboard for the socket that does not support overclocking, and the cheapest dual-channel RAM at the highest supported speed, 2666 MHz. As you probably noticed, the price of DDR4 RAM continues to be the Achilles heel of modern APU builds, and this time they are by far the most expensive component. On the Ryzen 200GE video, I complained that in order to keep the build under my target prices, sacrifices had to be made in RAM speed, which ultimately doomed the speed of the APU. RAM speed is very important for integrated GPU performance after all. Although I'm working on a better video measuring this, subscribe so you know when that comes out. Since this APU is half the price, that means that we can easily get the best supported RAM while still maintaining a price under 200 euros or near 220 for India for the core motherboard, RAM, CPU and GPU. Thanks to that, I was able to get any game I wanted somehow running on the thing with no major exceptions. If you want to get into PC gaming, then you absolutely need to spend as little as possible. I will still recommend something like paying super low prices for a trash 775 socket PC with a quad-core CPU, 8 gigs of DDR2 RAM, a cheap CPU, or a GT 1030 if you can find it in a good price. But as people like to point out in those videos, you're basically sacrificing future upgradability for lower cost, which is a valid decision if you're desperate. However, if you want to spend as little as possible, but only buy new components and you want to leave plenty of room for upgradability, I genuinely think this is the best choice. With a small core spending, you get a PC that you can get a ton of games working on low or ultra low settings but still pretty playable, some of them with very surprising performance that rivals a lot of cheap dedicated GPUs that will cost almost as much as the whole APU, and if you want to upgrade to the next level down the road, it is just a matter of adding a better dedicated GPU to do that work, and the Athlon CPU is perfectly able to keep up on most games in low settings. For example, for a quick experiment, I added a Radeon RX 550 that I used for the video on playing in 4K, and that is sandwiched between a GT 1030 and a GTX 1050 in terms of performance, at least in my experience. On Doom on full 720p and shadows enabled, it went way over 60 FPS before hitting a CPU bottleneck. Far Cry 5 in full 720 and no graphical tweaks was averaging 55 and only hitting CPU limits in very specific places. Shadow the Tomb Raider, the newest game on this list, with a dedicated GPU and DirectX 12, was able to reach 45 FPS on the most CPU heavy areas of the benchmark, with no stuttering. You can get away with playing 45 to 60 FPS in a lot of games before feeling that you want to upgrade your CPU. And when the time comes, and you want to change the CPU as well, this uses the same socket as all current Ryzen CPUs, so you have a ton of modern quad-core CPUs to go to. So in conclusion, when everyone was flocking at the Ryzen 200GE as the savior of budget builds of this generation, I liked the device but was not fully convinced. While the Athlon 200GE is not perfect, it could use an overclock, it is much closer to what I expected back then. It's half the price and when paired with the right RAM can pretty much run anything I threw at it, using the knowledge accumulated over many of my videos, which means you can get a ton out of it as your only CPU and GPU for a long time while leaving plenty of space open for future upgrades. Considering that it is a bit over half the price of the cheapest Ryzen APU, I think it is a fantastic value, as is investing in yourself and your skills with Skillshare, which you can start doing for free with access to all the premium tutorials for 2 months with the link down below. If you're considering making a video game to explore a new dimension of your creativity, like many of us are, and prefer working with examples, you can use this class I found on building a basic Unity car game in just 1 hour. You have to start somewhere, and Skillshare is a great place to start. Thank you to them for sponsoring this video, and you for supporting in Patreon.